Welcome to the Winning with the Losing Hand podcast series. I'm your host, Erwin Schofield. Quick question. Oh, all right. Welcome. I was on mute. Didn't realize it at the time. Thank you to my wife for reminding. Have you ever felt as if you were dealt a losing hand in your life or even in your current situation? And do you realize that a losing hand can generate a winning result? Well, today we want to make that abundantly clear as we talk through our topic of Reinvent Yourself with our special guests who are joining us. And it is our hope that you're encouraged by the things that we will share with you on today. So I want you to stay tuned as we prepare to enter the lion's den. All right, everybody, we're in the Lion's Den where we will be discussing some wonderful topics or sharing some wonderful wisdom with you. We have wonderful guests who are joining us to assist us in this process. You are listening to Winning with a Losing Hand with Erwin Schofield. And tonight's topic is Reinvent Yourself. I'm looking forward to what's going to be shared. And as we prepare to talk on this topic, I'd like to ask you to do me a favor and tag someone you know, share this stream to your page, encourage others to plug in and be a part of what's being shared here on tonight. By doing so, you might encourage another brother or sister who might tune in and benefit from what's being shared. So tonight we have two wonderful guests joining us. One who's currently in the studio, the other who is actually in the studio with us, but is going through some mic check, but he'll be joining us as well. They are going to walk us through various aspects and perspectives associated with the concept of reinventing yourself. I'll tell you who they are, and then we're going to bring them on the screen for our conversation on this evening. First, I have a very wonderful friend, colleague, a pastor who loves God and is, in my opinion, a very prolific preacher. He's also the author of a fantastic book entitled Lifeology, and that's none other than the person of Pastor P. Andre Wilson. We're going to be welcoming him to the stage with us or the platform with us, along with Pastor Edward Poku. Pastor Poku is a pastor in Middle River, Maryland. He's been pastoring the Word of Life Chapel, I want to say now for the last 20 years or better. He's originally from Ghana, Africa, from a town called Kumasi, but he's been here for a while serving, and he's been a blessing. I'm glad to call him a friend also. So with these two pastors, we're going to delve into the topic, and I ask you to help me welcome them to the platform. There we go. Welcome, sir. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you, sir?
That's good. I'm doing well, doing well. As I introduced earlier, we talked about your book, Lifeology. This is, I believe, your first published title that you wrote. And I'm going to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself to the audience. But I also wanted to kind of have that plug in there because, and I'm sure I told you this before, I read that book and I've been blessed by it. There's been some wonderful nuggets that you've placed in that book that I think many people ought to benefit from. So introduce yourself, and if you don't mind telling people how they can get a copy of your book.
Sure. I am P. Andre Wilson. The P is for my first name, Philip. Family and friends just call me Andre. I have the privilege of serving the Connect Church of Baltimore and father of my son and my daughter, both teenagers now, and happily, proudly married to my wife, L.A. Wilson. The book can be found on Amazon, Lifeology, practical lessons learned on the journey of life, and it can be found on Amazon. Glad to be here, Bishop. I appreciate you, sir.
All right, and we're glad to have you as well. We're also looking forward to welcoming Pastor Edward. And I'm wondering, Pastor Edward, is your mic working for you now? Okay. I'm assuming that he's not hearing us. So if that's the case, that he's not hearing us, we're going to go ahead and continue our conversation with you, Pastor Wilson.
Yes, sir.
So we are talking about, and let me make sure, did I call Poku Pastor Wilson? That might have been it. Pastor Poku, can you hear us? All right. Yeah, so we'll continue the conversation with you, sir. So let's kind of start off this conversation on reinvent yourself. And for the purpose of our guests who are joining us on today, I will let you know, just as a point of transparency, we kind of went down to the wire trying to get our checks in. And so there may be some aspects of our conversation in the opening that seemed a little flustered. So be patient with us. We'll get into our rhythm, and I think we will be very good. So thank you so much for your patience. So Pastor Wilson, when we talk about this concept of reinvent yourself, okay, what comes to mind for you first on that subject?
Well, I believe that for me personally, it all comes with doing a self-evaluation of oneself. I think often as men, we sometimes get lost in our own identity. For example, there's a common phrase that states, it's nothing wrong with being a copycat as long as you copy the right cat. And I do believe that there's quite a lot of truth to that. However, we can get accustomed to being a copy so much to the place where we never develop or even come to an awakening of who we are in our own identity. So I think that's one of the things, Bishop. It takes self-evaluation. Admiration is a great thing, but there's a thin line between admiration and losing who you are. And that's where that notion of copying, for example, I admire your ministry down through the years. You've been a great help as a template for how to approach ministry. However, I understand that I'm not you. And in order to be my best self, I need to evaluate who I am and come to a resolve of being okay being me.
Mhm. Awesome, awesome. And that makes perfect sense. We have to know who we are. We have to be okay with who we are. And when we hit those pockets where we may not be okay with who we are, we have to evaluate what's driving that. For example, like
Yes,
what's driving my sense of dissatisfaction with who I am?
right.
And does that warrant me going through reinventing type scenario? It's kind of interesting. I pulled up a definition that I didn't write, but I thought was kind of pretty interesting because there are different facets to this, right? And
Yeah,
and when I looked at it, let me tell you what it said first.
sure.
Reinventing yourself means identifying patterns, values, or activities that no longer serve you and changing them for better options. It can involve external characteristics like a job. You can reinvent yourself through your occupation or your career, if you will, where people change careers, I suppose. Hobbies, taking on a hobby that allows you to connect with who you are or maybe bring out who you are. Appearance, some people reinvent themselves through appearance, changing the way they look, if you will. Relationships and location. Um, then it goes on to say true reinvention also happens inside and how you think and behave. So there are so many ways that a person can reinvent themselves, um, to the point where reinvention for one person may not look like reinvention might look for another person. And with so many options, where we said earlier, that's why it was good to evaluate. If I'm
Yes.
not happy, what is it that I'm not happy about? And what better option do I have that will help bring out the best part of me? What are your thoughts about some of that?
No, it's true. And I think that it is one of those situations where um, we can't be afraid to transition and evolve. Um, Case in point, when you look at style, style changes every so many years. And there's some people that didn't necessarily change with the style as time has shifted. And here we are now back in this present time, um, going back to some of the old styles, like the thin cut suits that they used to wear in the 60s. And so it's one of those things where when you realize the necessity, you reference about an internal thing. And I think a lot of us, um, we go through this internal struggle that we hide really well. So our outward presentation presents one thing, but yet our internal condition presents a whole different thing. And they're in direct opposition. And so I think that one of the things that helps me to reflect and also evaluate self is knowing there's some changes I need to make. As a man that is about to enter into his 42nd year of life, I am not who I was when I was 40. I'm not the same person who I was when I was 28. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Of course, life circumstances and trials and tribulations have a direct impact of or effect of a direct impact on who we are. Excuse me, a direct
Mhm.
impact on who we are. And so I think if it's one of those things where I am forced to change, because a lot of times people aren't necessarily encouraged to change. So some type of push, kind of get under them like a little burning, and it kind of forces them to change. But when I look at myself and look at where I am and where I desire to go, sometimes I have to look back in order to see forward.
Mhm.
And when you look back in order to see forward, you're able to trace steps of where you may have taken on an identity that necessarily weren't yours. Bishop, I'm sure you can kind of recall in your life and coming up where we had those who preceded us and we were enamored by their preaching style. And sometimes we would mimic the very style of another. We would mimic the way they dress. We would mimic carrying a briefcase. I was carrying around a briefcase with hardly nothing in it, but I saw my grandfather carry a briefcase. And it was one of those things where for a long time I even tried to preach like him, tried to have his demeanor and everything. But it wasn't until I started really looking at myself and understanding something like with David when he was going to challenge Goliath. And he put on Saul's armor, but it didn't fit him. So David went back to what he knew. I'm going to defeat this crisis that Israel is facing with a slingshot and some stones. And so I think sometimes we have to do like David, go back to what we know works for us and defeat that crisis that is internal, that identity challenge that is internal, and understand it's okay for me to be who I am, but it's also okay for me to continue to grow. And I'll say this and leave it there, Bishop. Sometimes when you meet people that you haven't seen in years, you've transitioned in a multiplicity of ways, but they are still stuck where they are. And so it's one of those things where I have to challenge myself to evolve, even though I might be comfortable where I am.
Mhm. Man, that is great. And as you was talking, something like really jumped out at me. When you reference the experience of, early ministry, walking around with an empty briefcase.
Yeah.
I can relate to that. I can relate to that. There was something about having that what do you call it, attaché case,
Yes, sir.
where you have, a little bit of things in there. I think I might have had a Bible and a church bulletin,
Yes,
in
sir.
there. But early ministry, because since we're using this as an example in this particular vein, is where we have taken on or pursued those examples that we've seen before us.
Right.
And we've identified those styles that we might want to adapt to ourselves. And we may even run with those in the early stage of our ministry. But at some point, we can then reinvent ourselves because what we were doing was following somebody else's pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have to find our own, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think
Sir.
about my early preaching style, and because everybody I knew was loud, you know, I was loud,
Right.
preaching loud just became a thing because that's the type of preaching I was used to hearing.
Right.
But then as you develop in ministry and you realize that you don't have to be loud to be effective, you need to find what's working for you and what's going to help you connect with and convey the message to the audience. So there was
Yes.
this experience I had with Bishop Monroe Saunders Sr.
Mm-hmm.
He's certainly a general and a giant in the kingdom. He's passed away several years now, but his impact is just tremendous. And I remember sitting in a service with him while he was preaching,
Mm-hmm.
and he didn't yell, but he emphasized his words with such passion and tone without raising his voice. And I could feel, the movement of his words as he was, just sharing the message, and it was connecting. And it made me think, I said to myself, and I think I even prayed to the Lord, I will be glad when I get to the day where I can preach without having to raise my voice. I was kind of inspired by that and the reality that you can be effective without doing it. But see,
Absolutely.
even though that might be a manner in which I reinvent myself, I'm still doing it according to another pattern. You know,
Yes.
at
Yes.
some point, I have to identify who I am
Mm-hmm.
and be able to serve through my personality. Somebody wants to find preaching as, or ministry as preaching through personality. And so if you allow yourself to be utilized and leveraged by God in the transmission of the message, then you will be bringing your authentic self to his pure message and expressing what he would have to say. So,
Absolutely.
yes,
Absolutely.
I thought that was just dynamic the way you brought that in, and so I appreciate you, for doing it. And we're talking to men who are listening, and so when I kind of bring this in, what I'm going to do is expand it outside of the realm of ministry for just a second
Absolutely.
to talk about, you know, someone watching this may not be in ministry, and
Mm-hmm.
someone who's watching this may just be in church, and they may be thinking, what are the other ways that I can reinvent myself to be of benefit to my family, to be more successful in my personal career? Um, you know, any thoughts along that? Like, I'm looking at my life. I hit this rut. I want to soar beyond the heights that I've been reaching, which don't seem to be high for some folk. Um, what would reinvention look like for that person? If you have any ideas that you would like to share on that part of it.
First of all, I think that it is necessary for a man to understand the difference between function and personhood. Let me explain a little further. My function um, in the Wilson household, I function as a husband, I function as a father. As it pertains to serving, I function as a ministry leader. But that's what I do, that's my function. But my personhood is who I am. And I think all too often men are challenged with trying to fulfill their function and merge that with their personhood. And there's a distinct difference. Um, I'm learning more and more that if I spend so much time focusing on functionality, then I'm going to lose a sense of self. And I think that's one of the consequences that a lot of people have to deal with. We spend so much time as men um, being selfless. I'm gonna be a good father. I'm gonna be a good husband, and I'm gonna be a good friend because everybody's not in the context of marriage. I'm gonna be good at functioning. But after you're done functioning, friend, father, spouse, if that fits your category, leader, who are you as a person? Function deals with purpose, what you do. But personhood, what do you like? Are you your best self? And so one of the challenges for me was having to separate function from personhood. For instance, for an example, a lot of times people will, I was in a meeting one time and the question was posed, who are you? And so we went around the room and everybody introduced themselves. And everybody that preceded me introduced themselves by this introduction. Hi, my name is Bishop so and so. My name is Pastor so and so. When they got to me, I said, my name is Philip Andre Wilson. Because as a person, I understand that I need to be more in tune with my personhood and not introducing myself by a title, which is a function. So I think that's one of the things, Bishop, that a lot of challenges come into
Yeah,
place. Do you know who you are?
that's right.
Are
That's
you
good.
learning yourself?
Hmm.
Do you know what your triggers are? Do you know where you need to evolve as far as growth and improvement for self? Because we can't be good for anybody else until we first learn to be good to ourselves and understand who we are and not be so selfless till we lose a sense of self. I hope that
That
answers.
is, yeah, that's very good, and I can definitely attest to the importance of people, not losing themselves, identifying their person, and not relying so heavily on titles,
Mm-hmm.
because I think that also came out of what you were saying when people introduce themselves, that they introduce themselves with an attachment, a title, sometimes maybe a degree and things of that nature.
Yes, sir.
I think one of the big values we have is when we can introduce ourselves without all of those things, because
Yes, sir.
it may indicate that you have identified your value apart from. Like,
Yes.
you got to have a value apart from those things. Like, I'm just looking at the screen and I noticed that today my name on the screen says Bishop Irwin Schofield.
Yes,
This
sir.
is like this is the first time that I had Bishop Irwin Schofield on here. I mean, I don't know if it carried over from another conversation I had somewhere else,
Yes,
but
sir.
usually I just have my first and last name,
Mm-hmm.
and there's a reason for it. Is at this stage in my life, I want to appreciate who God has cultivated me to be, apart from any labels I might be used to using, you know.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
If I oftentimes say to people, my power is not in my title,
Right.
and so it would serve that if my power isn't in my title, I need to learn how to be comfortable, not necessarily having to lean on, my
Yes,
title,
sir. Yes, sir.
so I can understand me. And it's at that core of understanding me that I could go further in redefining some things. Because what I'm not trying to do, Pastor Andre, I'm not trying to rewrite God's plan and purpose for my life.
Yes.
When I'm saying reinvent yourself, I'm not trying to rewrite God's plan and purpose for my life. There is no success apart from his plan and purpose. And so if he has a plan and purpose and I'm trying to design myself different from that plan and purpose, I'm setting myself up for failure. But
Hmm.
there are some things that, within the construct of being a balanced person, that
Yeah.
allows me to reinvent myself. Like, for example, some years ago, my sister started teaching me line dancing,
Hmm.
right?
Right.
And whereas I don't have any rhythm at all, and I probably was like stiff, but that whole exercise portion of it, kind of tapped into a whole new element of how I express, myself with people in communication and conversation and things of the nature. So if somebody
Hmm.
said, "Oh, he's just so straight, strict, churchy," and then they see, oh, but he does have a balanced, relaxed side,
Hmm.
in a way that's reinventing myself to not be so stiff and stoic in a certain regard as well, as it pertains to what we said earlier about the many ways that we can kind of reinvent ourselves. But I like the
Yeah.
fact that you mentioned that it comes down to us knowing who we are and understanding our person, so that we can move forward in our life and the development that,
Can I add one other thing, Bishop?
sure, absolutely.
I think sometimes for me, what I'm learning to do, because COVID-19 brought forth many variables, as I think it done with has done with many individuals. Um, and so one of the things that I am learning to do is, um, in the words of the old folks, steal away. I'm learning to reinvent myself as it pertains to focusing on my wellness, not just mental, but my entirety, spiritual wellness, physical wellness, financial wellness, just wellness. And sometimes we can be so accustomed to wanting to be in the mix of things or around people to the place where it causes us to be distracted and start to ignore who we are and where we need to fine tune some areas and tune up in some areas as it relates to who we are. And that comes from getting by yourself and doing the self work, because often it's impossible to really recognize what areas, whether it's physical, emotional, spiritual, what areas need fine tuning if you're always around other people. And so sometimes people will assume that you may be standoffish or acting funny, but it for me it pulls me back to make sure I'm just trying to make sure I don't lose myself. Because again, that functionality piece of, it's like, yeah, I'm good to function here, but I need to make sure that I don't lose my personhood. And so, but I don't want to jump ahead of anything, so I'll let you lead the
No,
way.
that's really good. That's really good. And so, can I add to what you said, which is,
Sure.
you know, and I appreciate you for bringing that up because, see, a lot of people don't have the courage to pull back and unapologetically focus on self development and
Yeah.
growth,
Hmm.
because we almost feel obligated to respond to people, obligated to be an audience to people when they're
That's
reaching
right.
out or calling and things of that nature. We're almost feeling obligated to the point that we're not spending that time building ourselves up
Yeah.
and defining, our path the way we ought to. So I commend you on having the courage to do that, knowing that some people might misunderstand
Hmm.
or assume that you are withdrawing from them, when in actuality it has nothing to do
No.
with the other individual. And we live in a society where if you're not answering people's call, they translate it as they don't like me, they're against me, they're not in my
Right.
corner.
Right.
It's They don't realize that you may be, focusing on something that is well beyond them, has
Yeah.
nothing to do with them, but because
Hmm.
of how they feel in their perspective of not getting through to you,
Right.
they painted this whole picture. I've often said this, that in the absence of knowledge, in the absence of true knowledge, our mind is left to speculate,
Mm.
and we speculate a whole lot, right? We
Hmm.
speculate, well, this person hasn't spoken to me in 2 months, so therefore, you know, they must have an attitude with me.
Hmm.
That's not true, but people go there, and they have
Yeah.
to learn how to not go there. What would be the tragedy is for us to feel like we can't pull away and do that personal reinvention, rebuilding, redevelopment, or fine tune, focus, reset, etc., because of how it would be perceived by other people. So it takes
Yeah.
courage. It
Yeah.
takes courage to do what you described, and it takes courage for a person to reinvent themselves and present a new version of themselves to their circle or their audience. So I'm glad that
Can
you
I
did
add
that.
something real quick?
Sure.
You know, there's something known as the mirror effect.
Hmm.
And when an individual look in the mirror and they can no longer recognize themselves, that's a red flag. You referenced the whole notion of the phone call. So I work in medical oncology. So I'm working and I'm advocating for cancer patients for treatment and everything. So today, when my supervisor sent me my report, she said, "Did you know that you talked to 112 people today?" Bishop, I don't know 112 people, but yet I talked to personally, but I talked to 112 people today dealing with various intense and very strenuous issues. So, one of the ways that I help to reinvent myself in order to reboot, when I leave work, I turn my phone off. I take naps. And you said something that's so true. A lot of times there's an assumption, and I coined the phrase assumptions are like termites. They'll eat away at the core of your foundation and they will destroy relationships. People assume sometimes that if you're not accessible on the phone or you didn't answer a text message or and they really don't realize sometimes you have been so swamped and overwhelmed, and then you have to go back to where you left from, as far as home. You got to be a husband if that's what your role is, because a lot of times people can tell you how to be a husband, but they've never been a husband. I don't never understood that. But in any case, they tell you how to be a father, but they don't have children. They tell you how you should react, and it's like, no, I'm really not standoffish or whatever. No, I can't show up to everything, because nowadays, Bishop, one of the ways that I've started to reinvent myself on Saturdays, like for the next couple of months, my Saturdays are blocked where I'm not doing anything. And I have to do that because as you get older, Bishop, you have to refocus on, hey, that didn't hurt when I went to sleep, but now that I wake up, this hurts. And so I have to fine tune and put more emphasis on making sure I'm crossing my T's and dotting my I's so that when I do come back out, I can be that good friend. I can be that good associate. I can help carry the load over here. But sometimes the load of an identity crisis comes from how we mismanage the weight. And I think that's sometimes how we fall into that place of crisis. I
Yeah.
mean, it's a challenging thing, and it's a major issue, but we keep working at it. But that's the operative word.
Yeah.
You have to work at it.
Right.
And so that's one of the things that I'm really learning to do, and learning to be okay being misunderstood if I have to be misunderstood, as long as I'm understanding myself.
Yes.
And
Yes.
one of the things, Bishop, I'll say this: um, the value of relationships, no matter how long a person has gone, where they may have been silenced, if you're able to pick back up where you left off, it's like taking the pause button off, and you're going back in the mode of play. And that's one of the things that I find value in learning to. At this stage in life, I am on the track of reinventing myself. You mentioned being able to stand and get used to your voice and not be offended how you sound to yourself. Um, your mannerisms and how you approach things, and not fall into this place of comparison addiction, because a lot of times that's where that root of insecurity is having to compare yourself to the next individual. And I'm
Yes.
going to stop because I don't want to jump ahead you
Yeah,
ahead of you.
well, this is all good stuff, and I'm glad we're having the conversation. I mean, we're going to break in a second here, but before we do, I just kind of want to recap some of this reinvention talk that we've been having, and then we're going to kind of go into a quick break and get some
Sure.
announcements out the way and pick back up. But I'm thinking back on, like, so I had read this definition. Reinventing yourself means identifying patterns, values, activities that no longer serve you
Mm-hmm.
and changing them for better options.
Mm-hmm.
So identifying where you are, what you're doing, what's working and what's not working,
That's right.
and then changing them for better options to either improve upon where you are, to grow from where you are. And then it goes on to say it can involve external characteristics and
Mm-hmm.
internal. With
Mm-hmm.
the external characteristics, like changing a job can be a way you reinvent yourself. Like
Yes.
if a person comes from being there was an example of a guy who was a lawyer who
Mm-hmm.
decided that he's going to stop being a lawyer in order to be a school teacher, because
Mm-hmm.
he worked with young boys or people who got stuck in the system. And being stuck in the system, their life was being decided by a judge or a jury. And he felt like, I want to be able to impact them before they get to this situation. And so he reinvented himself. He went from being a lawyer to an
I hear
educator,
them now.
and being able to educate. Let me make sure. Okay, gotcha. And being able to educate uh, the young kids, prevent it. The idea was to prevent them from needing to reach out to him when it was almost too late. So there was an element of reinvention, going from a lawyer to an educator so that he can position himself to be a better uh, value and contributor to the life and the success of kids. And that's good how it does that with the job. Same thing with hobbies, appearances, relationships, locations, and then of course how you think and behave. And I
Yes.
thought back to my personal one of my personal reinventions is I learned a long time ago that arguing with people really validates their concern or issue. And if I had to raise my voice in order to prove a point or to express myself, I really suggested that that person is controlling the conversation and
Yeah.
the atmosphere and the ambiance of whatever this exchange is. And I
Mm-hmm.
remember making up in my mind that I'm going to have personal control over myself
Yes, sir.
and not allow a person to cause me to get out of character in
Mm-hmm.
how I talk, my tone, my language, and things of that nature. And so, whenever there was a challenge or concern, I maintained a certain calm because that's who I wanted to be. That's
Yes.
another form of reinventing yourself, going from being a boisterous person, an argumentative person, a person who debates, a person who wrestles, or a person who spars with words, to being
Mm-hmm.
a more controlled person who realized that even in the still of their presence, that they
Mm-hmm.
can still have control and regulate an atmosphere within a conversation, and that did become an element of reinvention. So we're going to pick up on some more of this on the other side
Sure.
of our announcements. But what we want to do is to now just share some announcements with our audience, and hopefully you're getting something out of the conversation, on today. So let me start with my promo, and on the other side of that, give you some announcements. All right, something doesn't want to work for me today. You're in the lion's den, and you're watching Winning with the Losing Hand with yours truly, Erwin Schofield. Consider sharing this live stream to your page so that other men may benefit from what we have to share today. And if you follow us on Facebook or YouTube, you can be notified instantly the moment we go live. How about I get you back to the program? All right, everybody. So, again, we thank you for joining us for this podcast. We just have a little more to go, but just in a way of sharing some announcements with you. First of all, we thank you for tuning in, and we hope you would tune in with us every third Tuesday of the month when we talk through these topics. It's been my delight to have various guests join us and to share their insight and wisdom on these various topics. And I think it might be good for me to reiterate to you at this point that if you have any topics you want us to consider, or if you know some folk that you would like to recommend that we talk to, feel free to reach out to us through our Winning with the Losing Hand podcast page and share your thoughts and suggestions with us so that we can incorporate them. Also, I want to mention the last time we got together, I was talking about my book launch. And so the book did launch, and we had some really good feedback for the book. So, with that said, we certainly want to remind you that Divine Dosages is available at Amazon.com. And we certainly welcome you to pick up your copy and to share your feedback with us as it pertains to the Divine Dosage book. And the one other thing that I'm going to mention with you on today is this Winning with the Losing Hand podcast. We air it or stream it live once a month on the third Tuesday of the month. But we've also started the Essay Podcast, which is a podcast that we produce and publish weekly. So that's a new addition to our podcast lineup, the Essay Podcast, where I will be raising my voice on various subjects. If you look for that page on Facebook, you'll be able to follow two of the episodes that have already been published for the year so far. And we certainly encourage you to follow us there as well. With that said, again, we thank you for tuning in today. We hope that you are getting something out of this and that you would share it with those that you know, men that you know who can benefit from these conversations. And with that said, we're going to give you the promo one more time, and we're going to go back into our conversation with our guests. You're in the lion's den, and you're watching Winning with the Losing Hand with yours truly, Erwin Schofield. Consider sharing this live stream to your page so that other men may benefit from what we have to share today. And if you follow us on Facebook or YouTube, you can be notified instantly the moment we go live. How about I get you back to the program? All right. So, welcome back to the program, and we're going to be bringing our guests back on. I believe I understand that we were able to work it out for Pastor Poku to be on. So as we put our guests back on the screen, we certainly want to continue our conversation in the last minutes that remain for this episode. So again, we've been talking with Pastor Andre Wilson. We have Pastor Edward Poku. Pastor Poku, how are you, sir?
I'm doing well, sir, Bishop.
All right, man. It's just a joy to be able to hear your voice. It's a joy
Amen.
to hear your
Me
voice.
too.
So I want to plug you into the conversation, but in the process of doing so, I want to take a quick moment. I shared with folk early on that you were from Ghana and that you're pastoring. I want to say it's been more than 20 years now in the States, but can you kind of correct me on anything I got wrong? Just briefly share where you're from, how you came to be here in the States, and the church that you pastor.
Okay. You want me to share a little bit about that?
Yes.
As Bishop said, I'm from Ghana, in a city called Kumasi. I believe, Bishop, you've been there before. Yeah. So about 20 years ago, I came to the United States. I came from Sweden. I came to Bible school in Sweden. The Lord led me to United States, straight to Baltimore. And I had in contact with Bishop through a Bishop friend that I consider my father. So both of them were like my fathers. And they taught me a lot of lessons. And that is how we became ministry partners and friends and brothers in the body of Christ. So I've been around. This year will be 20 years in our church, celebrating our 20 years of anniversary in our church in September. And by the grace of God, I'm married with 3 kids and 1 adopted child. And everybody's doing well. By the grace of God, ministry is doing well. And tomorrow, I'm going to be celebrating my 54th birthday. I'll be 54 tomorrow.
Wow.
Awesome.
Wow. Happy birthday to you, sir. Man,
Thank
that's
you.
good. That is good. Yeah, God has been good to you, man.
Awesome.
You don't look old enough to be 54, but we thank God that he preserves the way he does. Yeah, that's awesome.
Yes.
So, Pastor Edward, we were talking about reinvent yourself, and I know one of the things that we wanted to do in this second end is to really see if we can identify a Bible character that went through some form of reinvention, reinventing themselves in Scripture, and then to kind of share some lesson learned from that. I want to start off with you since we haven't had the opportunity to talk with you yet. Can you think of a Bible character that had reinvented themselves, so to speak, and some lesson that we might be able to glean from that?
Okay. I have a couple, but because of our time, I will stay within my time. So one of the characters that I pick is from Daniel chapter 6. I reading from verse 10. Daniel chapter 6, reading from verse 10 all the way to 12. So I'll quickly read it. I'll start from 9. The Bible says that so King Darius issued a written verdict. When Daniel realized that a written decree had been issued, he entered his home where the windows in his upper room opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times daily he was kneeling and offering prayers and thanks to his God, just as he had been accustomed to do previously. Then those officials who had gone to the king came by collusion and found Daniel praying and asking for help before his God. So they approached the king and said to him, "Did you not issue an edict to the effect that for the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human other than you, O king, will be thrown into a lion's den?" The king replied, "That is correct, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be changed." So, can you hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, when you look at this passage, left to Daniel alone, he was just serving his God, being a wonderful person in his time, and he was a person of prayer. But some people connive against him that he will not be able to pray again. So an issue was established that Daniel cannot pray. And being a man who loved his God, went into his prayer room right after the verdict or the decree, opened the windows, and he started praying. I'm looking at the situation. Daniel wanted to please his God, or Daniel wanted to please God. And these people wanted to oppose him pleasing his God, just to please his God. But the whole story turned around to the extent that in verse 16 to 27, because of time, I can't read it. Verse 16 to 27, they arrested Daniel and they put him in the lion's den. And the Bible says that Daniel was there all night and the king could not sleep. Okay? The king lost his sleep. So early in the morning, the Bible says that the king went to the lion's den to see if Daniel is dead, because I believe that the king loved Daniel so much that he didn't want him to die. But because of the verdict or because of the decree that he signed, he can't go against it. So I believe that the king was panicking that Daniel would die. But lo and behold, God being so good, the king went there and Daniel was still alive. And the Bible says that when Daniel came out of the lion's den, he became a new person. He bounced back. He became a new person through his faith. From that time, the king declared that everybody in his kingdom will follow Daniel's God. Everybody will respect Daniel's God. And at the end of the day, those who oppose him became like his slaves. All of them who opposed Daniel, all of them died. So if you look at the whole situation, Daniel wanted to serve God, but the enemy wanted to pin him down. But Daniel bounced back. When he came back, he became even more popular. He became more known. His fame spread abroad everywhere in that country. So I see reinvention here. Daniel went down to the grave, went down to the lion's den, but he came back as a new person with more power, with
Absolutely.
more fame, and to the extent that the king told the whole nation that we have to respect Daniel's God. But before, Daniel's God was not respected. Daniel knew God, served God in his room, be a faith person all around. But this time, the reinvention came like double. The whole nation recognized Daniel as somebody who has to be respected and the God that Daniel serves.
That's great.
Amen.
So basically, from his experience of sometimes God can take us through or allow us to go through something that is so dynamic that it actually has a transformative effect,
Yeah.
for us. And which is what I was gleaning, from what you were saying. This ordeal for Daniel, his faith positioned him to where God could work this miracle. And then coming out of it, obviously, it was transformative for him in many ways, not just internally,
Yes. That's
also
right.
in the way other people were able to view and affect him. So let's say if Daniel always had this core of being a good person, but people now see him different. That this divinely assistant reinvention, whereas we can't look at Daniel the way we used to look at him,
Mhm.
because after what we witnessed with Daniel, oh, he
Mm.
wants a whole new level of respect and
Yes.
appreciation. I think that's awesome. And I want to
Absolutely.
kind of shift over to Pastor Andre too. We're coming down to our last 5 minutes, and I want to give you an opportunity to kind of add any lessons gleaned from a Bible character that you feel may have reinvented themselves.
Sure. I'll make this brief. So I was thinking about, as the pastor was talking, I thought about Gideon and how he was chosen by God to be one of the greatest leaders to lead an army against those that were attacking. It was Amalekites and others, the Midianites that were a threat to Israel. However, Gideon did not see himself from the vantage point that God saw Gideon. So Gideon had to have a self assessment and something known as the awakening effect. Gideon had to come to terms with who God had called him to be in spite of who he saw himself as being. And so I think that if there's anything that I can bring to a close, it is to come to a resolve that when God calls you to be who he has called you to be, to trust God's wisdom to understand that it does not take God by surprise any insufficiencies that you have, any uh, issues with low self-esteem or whatever. It would be a negative indictment if God didn't know what he was doing. But because he's all knowing, he knows who he chooses. He doesn't stand before a board. He doesn't need anybody to approve his approval. In the end, when God chooses us, he sees us fully developed. Yes, we go through the process, but he sees us fully developed. So we should all take courage in understanding that at the end of the day, just like Gideon was able to lead with courage, was able to lead with confidence, was able to lead with assurance because he saw himself from God's perspective. We need to learn to see ourselves from God's perspective and be okay being who we are because God has fearfully and wonderfully made us.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And gentlemen, I really do. I thank you for being on. I want to kind of recap in my last minute, but I want to personally thank you guys for being on. I want to have you on again. I know we had some early on technical difficulties, and I want to, be able to have you on where we can really benefit from the, full conversation among us. And so I hope you, would be willing to join me again on a session
Sure.
on Winning with the Losing Hand.
Yeah.
You have been a blessing, and I know there's even more that you have that you can pour out into our audience to bless them as well. As a way of recapping, where we are and some of the wonderful things that we've heard, especially aligning with the examples that have been presented. The last one being the Gideon example, which I think is absolutely amazing. Gideon, who would have potentially been considered a coward threshing wheat in a wine press, to go to being a conqueror who leads a band of soldiers against an army that is exponentially larger than him. It had to begin with the reinvention of Gideon. And I'm so glad of how Pastor Wilson kind of brought that in, because this also helps us. First, let me say this as I try and wrap this up for us real quick. The first thing is, reinventing is not about making yourself into what you want you to be per se. Reinventing is about correcting, making adjustments to who you are so that you can thrive into who God has called you to be.
Absolutely.
So when we talk about reinventing yourself, we're not saying figure out what you want to be and then become that person. No, instead, we're saying figure out who God created you to be, because in all reality, who God created you to be is the absolute best version of you could ever be, because you are designed for that. You are equipped for that. God has given you everything you need to succeed in that space. And so when you figure that out and start to make moves toward it, you will see that your life flows better. Your ability to be effective gets better because you're spiritually aligned with the will of God for your life. So the reinvention process is, almost, if I could use an analogy, is almost like the pruning process, where Jesus said in one space, the branch that brings forth fruit, he prunes it so that it can bring forth more fruit. He's trying to get more out of it. And the pruning process is designed to do that. So when you look at your life, and it may not necessarily be that you're totally unproductive, you might be productive, but up to a certain point. Whereas by a slight reinvention, anything that kind of keeps you stuck or doesn't have you maximizing your productivity, your success, your effectiveness, that when you make that slight change, it releases those barriers and allow you to soar higher and go further into what God has called you to do. And so basically, we're saying to you, identify God's purpose for your life and learn how to reinvent yourself to bring you closer and closer toward optimal performance or optimal execution of that plan and purpose that God has for your life. So as I conclude, what I'm basically trying to tell you is, don't think about reinvention apart from the will of God, the work of God, and the power of God. But within that framework, take advantage of every opportunity you can to evaluate your patterns, your values, and your activities to see what's working and what's not working, and make tweaks as necessary so that you can become a newer, a better version of yourself, achieving all the great things that God has in store for you. I thank you for listening. I thank you for being here with us. I thank you for your time, and I hope you would join us next month as we come back together for Winning with a Losing Hand. I'm going to say good night to you, and I hope you have a blessed evening. Thank you for joining us here today. And please meet us here every third Tuesday of the month at 7 o'clock p.m. We're excited about the upcoming episodes and the wonderful guests who will join us to be a blessing to you and your family.